Chapter 1. The quiet village Mary's Mead was the sort of place where nothing ever happened, or so it seemed. Nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes were as timeless as the church bell that tolled each Sunday. The villagers prided themselves on their quiet lives, their predictable routines. Tea at 4, gossip at the post office, and the occasional squabble over the flower show. But beneath the surface of this idyllic hamlet, secrets simmered waiting for the right moment to boil over. Miss Jane Marple, with her soft white hair and deceptively mild blue eyes, was no stranger to those secrets. From her cottage on Mead Lane, she observed the world with a keenness that belied her frail appearance. Knitting needles clicking rhythmically, she pieced together the village's unspoken truths as deftly as she stitched her scarves. She knew, for instance, that Mrs. Price at the bakery was hiding a dalliance with the postman, and that young Tommy Pierce had been pilfering apples from the vicarage orchard. But what Miss Marple didn't know yet was that St. Mary's Mead was about to be shaken by a scandal buried deeper than the roots of its ancient yew trees. It was a crisp October morning when the trouble began. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, and Miss Marple was tending her chrysanthemums when a piercing scream shattered the stillness. It came from the direction of the vicarage, a handsome Georgian house just beyond the churchyard. Dropping her trowel, Miss Marple straightened, her heart quickening not with fear, but with curiosity. She adjusted her straw hat and set off at a brisk pace, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. By the time she reached the vicarage garden, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, stood pale and trembling, clutching her shawl. The gardener, old Mr. Hobbs, was muttering to himself, his spade abandoned in the dirt. At the centre of the commotion lay a freshly dug flower bed, and in it, sprawled unnaturally, was a body. A woman, her face half hidden by a tangle of dark hair, her coat stained with earth and something darker. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Who is she?" "No one knows," whispered Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived breathless from her manor house. "She's not from the village, that's certain. Poor thing, look at her hands, all scratched and bloody. She must have fought for her life." Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the woman's hands, indeed torn and dirt-caked, as if she'd clawed at the earth in desperation. Her coat, though muddied, was of fine wool, and a single pearl earring glinted in the morning light. A stranger, then, but not without means. Miss Marple's mind began to turn, cataloguing details, the position of the body, the disturbed soil, the faint bruise on the woman's throat. The vicar, Mr. Clement, emerged from the house, his face ashen. I don't understand," he stammered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We were to plant roses today. Hobbs was just breaking ground when he found her. Buried shallow, wasn't she?" Mr. Hobbs growled, his voice rough with shock. "Whoever did this didn't have time to do it proper, or didn't care, or wanted her found Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. The crowd fell silent, turning to her. She smiled faintly, as if she'd merely commented on the weather. It's curious, don't you think? A body in the vicarage garden, of all places. One might almost think it a message. A message? Mrs. Clement's voice was shrill. Jane, surely you don't mean, oh, it's too horrible. Horrible, yes, Miss Marple agreed, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. But not random, I suspect. Murder seldom is. The distant wail of a police siren cut through the air, signalling the arrival of Inspector Craddock from Much Benham. The crowd parted as he strode in, his notebook already open, his expression grim. He knelt by the body, careful not to disturb the scene, and beckoned to the constable trailing behind him. "Miss Marple," he said, glancing up with a mix of respect and exasperation. "I might have known you'd be here." "One does like to be helpful," she replied, her lips twitching into a smile. "Though I dare say you'll have your hands full with this one, Inspector." Craddock grunted, turning back to the body. No identification yet, no purse, no papers, just this. He held up a small silver locket, its clasp broken, retrieved from the soil near the woman's hand. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, no more than 10, with solemn eyes. Miss Marple leaned closer, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. "A keepsake," she murmured, "and a clue, perhaps." As the police began cordoning off the garden, Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. A stranger in St. Mary's Mead, buried in haste, clutching a locket with a child's picture. The village, so peaceful on the surface, was hiding something that had led to murder, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to uncover it. Chapter 2. Whispers of Scandal. The news of the body in the vicarage garden spread through St. Mary's Mead like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, the village was abuzz, its quiet lanes humming with speculation. At the post office, the butcher's and the Blue Boar Inn, tongues wagged with theories, each more outlandish than the last. The victim, it seemed, was no ordinary stranger, and the villagers, ever eager for drama, were determined to unearth her story before the police did. Miss Marple, however, preferred to listen rather than speak. She sat in her usual corner of the village shop, a basket of groceries at her feet, her knitting needles clicking softly. The shop was a hive of gossip, and Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was holding court behind the counter, her voice carrying over the clink of coins. "She was no lady, mark my words," Mrs. Price declared, slicing a loaf with rather more force than necessary. "That coat of hers, fine enough, but the hem was frayed, and those boots scuffed to bits. She'd come down in the world, I'd wager. Frayed or not, she had that pearl earring," piped up Miss Weatherby, a spinster with a penchant for melodrama, stolen most likely, or payment for, well, you know. She lowered her voice, but not so much that Miss Marple couldn't hear. "A kept woman, perhaps." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, her lips pursing. A kept woman? Possible, but unlikely. The scratches on the victim's hands suggested struggle, not scandalous liaisons. Still, she let the conversation flow, gathering threads of gossip as carefully as she gathered her wool. "I heard she was renting Rose Cottage," said young Clara, the shop assistant, her eyes wide. "Moved in just a month ago, paid in cash, and barely spoke to anyone. Kept her curtains drawn, too. Shady, if you ask me. Shady or not, someone wanted her dead," Mrs. Price said darkly. "Buried in the vicarage garden, of all places. It's a disgrace. Poor Mr. Clement must be beside himself." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. Rose Cottage was a small, ivy-clad house on the edge of the village, secluded but not invisible. A month was hardly enough time to make enemies, unless the enmity had followed her here. She made a mental note to visit the cottage later, perhaps with a plausible excuse, like delivering a parish newsletter. As the gossip swirled, the shop door jingled, and Mrs. Bantry swept in, her cheeks flushed from the autumn chill. "Jane!" she exclaimed, spotting Miss Marple. "You'll never believe what I've heard. They're saying the woman was seen arguing with a man near the church last week. Late at night, no less." "Indeed." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "And who saw this, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, nobody directly, but it's what people are saying. A tall man, they think, with a limp. Or was it a hat? Oh, it's all so muddled." "Rumours often are," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "But they do have a way of pointing to something real, if one sifts carefully." Mrs. Bantry perched on a stool, undeterred. "What do you make of it, Jane? You were there this morning. That locket the inspector found. Whose picture was in it? Her daughter, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said non-committally. Theodosia, a photograph of the solemn-eyed girl, had lingered in her mind. A daughter, a sister, or someone else entirely. The locket's broken clasp suggested it had been torn off, perhaps in a struggle, another thread to tug. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who stepped into the shop with a weary sigh. The villagers fell silent, their eyes darting to him expectantly. He nodded politely to Miss Marple, who returned the gesture with a serene smile. "Any news, Inspector?" Mrs. Price ventured, her tone a mix of curiosity and bravado. Craddock's jaw tightened. "We've identified the victim. Her name was Eleanor Vance, 38, no known, family. She rented Rose Cottage under an assumed name, Ellen Varney. We're still piecing together her past, but it's complicated." "Complicated?" Miss Weatherby's voice was a squeak. "You mean she was hiding something?" "I mean," Craddock said firmly, "that we're investigating all possibilities. If anyone has information, actual information, not gossip, my office is open." His gaze lingered on the room, then softened as it met Miss Marple's. "Miss Marple, a word, if you please." She followed him outside, her knitting tucked into her basket. The street was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves. Skittering across the cobblestones, Craddock ran a hand through his hair, looking more tired than he had that morning. "You've got a knack for seeing things others miss," he said bluntly. "This Vance woman, she had no business in a place like St. Mary's Mead. No connections, no clear reason to be here. Yet someone went to the trouble of killing her and burying her where she'd be found. Why?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Why, indeed? A shallow grave suggests haste, or perhaps intent. The vicarage garden is public enough to ensure discovery, but private enough to delay it. Whoever did this wanted her found, but not too soon." Craddock frowned. "You think it's someone local?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Eleanor Vance came here for a reason, and that reason got her killed. The question is whether she was running from something or toward it." As Craddock jotted down her words, Miss Marple glanced toward the church spire, visible above the rooftops. The vicarage garden was just beyond, its flower bed now a crime scene. Eleanor Vance, with her frayed coat and broken locket, had brought a scandal to St. Mary's Mead, one that was already unravelling the village's carefully woven facade, and Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, was determined to follow every thread. Chapter 3. The Vicar's Confession. The vicarage was a haven of calm, or so it had always seemed. Its ivy-clad walls and leaded windows exuded a timeless serenity, a stark contrast to the grim discovery in its garden. Miss Marple approached the front door the following afternoon, a basket of homemade scones in hand, a pretext for her visit, though she doubted anyone would be fooled. The village was still reeling from Eleanor Vance's murder, and the vicar, Mr. Leonard Clement, was at the heart of the storm. Mrs. Clement answered the door, her face pale and her smile strained. "Oh, Jane, how kind of you to come," she said, ushering Miss Marple inside. "It's been dreadful, simply dreadful. Leonard hasn't slept a wink." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said sympathetically, stepping into the parlour. The room was cosy, with chintz curtains and a fire crackling in the grate, but an air of unease hung over it. "I thought a few scones might lift the spirits. You're a saint," Mrs. Clement said, though her hands trembled as she took the basket. "Leonard's in his study. He's been there all morning poring over his sermons, or so he says. I think he's just hiding from the world." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes flicking to the closed study door. "Might I have a word with him, just to see how he's faring?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, I'll put the kettle on. Perhaps tea will help." The study was a small, book-lined room, its desk cluttered with papers and a well-worn Bible. Mr. Clement sat hunched over, his spectacles perched on his nose, but his gaze was fixed on the window, where the garden and its grim flower-bed was just visible. He started as Miss Marple knocked softly. "Miss Marple," he said, rising awkwardly. "Forgive me, I didn't hear you come in. Please, sit." She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, and studied him. The vicar was a gentleman, nearing 60, with a kind face and a nervous habit of tugging at his collar. Today he looked older, his eyes shadowed with something more than fatigue. "I won't keep you long, Mr. Clement," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing. "I only wanted to see how you and Mrs. Clement are managing. Such a shock finding, well, what you found." He flinched, his fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. "A shock, yes. I still can't fathom it. A body in our garden. It feels like a violation, Miss Marple, as if the sanctity of this place has been tainted." "Indeed," she said, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. The rhythmic sound seemed to soothe him, or perhaps it was her calm presence. "And yet, it's curious, isn't it? The garden is so central to the village, yet so private. Whoever chose it must have known it well." Mr. Clement's eyes darted to hers, then away. "Known it, I suppose. Well, anyone could wander through. The gates never locked." "But to bury someone," Miss Marple continued, her voice, soft, requires time and nerve, and perhaps a reason to point to the vicarage itself. He paled, his hand straying to his collar. "Point to the vicarage? Surely you don't think—" "Oh, I don't think anything yet," she said with a reassuring smile. "I only wonder. You see, I heard Eleanor Vance was renting Rose Cottage. Did you ever meet her, perhaps in passing?" The vicar hesitated, and in that pause Miss Marple saw a flicker of something. Guilt, fear, or perhaps merely unease. Yes, once or twice," he admitted at last. "She came to a service a few weeks ago. Sat at the back, didn't speak to anyone. I tried to welcome her, but she seemed distant." "Distant," Miss Marple echoed, her needles pausing. "And did she ever mention anything about herself? Her past, perhaps?" Mr. Clement shook his head, but his fingers twitched, betraying his nerves. "No, nothing. She was polite but reserved. I assumed she wanted privacy." Miss Marple nodded, letting the silence stretch. She had learned over the years that silence could be as persuasive as questions. The vicar shifted in his seat, then spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was one thing," he said, his eyes fixed on the desk. "After the service, she lingered in the churchyard. I saw her by the old yew tree, near the graves. She was looking at one in particular, an old stone, half covered in moss. I thought it odd, but I didn't ask. Perhaps I should have." "Which grave?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, but her mind alert. He swallowed. "The Havisham plot. You know, the family that owned the manor before the Bantrys. Most of them died out years ago, but their graves are still there. I don't know why she was interested." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. The Havisham family, a name tied to whispers of wealth, tragedy, and a scandal long buried in the village's memory. "How curious," she murmured. "And you never saw her again?" "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "That is, I mean not to speak to. I may have seen her in the lane once or twice, but nothing more." She smiled, tucking her knitting away. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Clement. I shan't trouble you further. Do give my regards to Mrs. Clement." As she rose, Her gaze fell on a small photograph on the desk. A young girl, perhaps 10, with solemn eyes. It was not unlike the picture in Eleanor Vance's locket, though the frame was old and tarnished. She said nothing, but her mind catalogued the detail, another thread in the tapestry of the murder. Outside the air was sharp with the promise of rain. Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, her eyes lingering on the flower bed, now roped off with police tape. The vicar knew more than he was saying. She was certain of it. His confession, small as it was, had opened a door to the past, to the Havishams and their long-forgotten scandal. Eleanor Vance had come to St. Mary's Mead for a reason, and that reason lay buried not just in the earth, but in the secrets of the village itself. Chapter 4. Tea and Secrets. The village hall of St. Mary's Mead was a modest affair, its walls adorned with faded photographs and a banner proclaiming the annual flower show. On this particular Saturday afternoon, it was transformed into a battlefield of polite society, where teacups clinked and gossip cut like a well-aimed dart. The occasion was Mrs. Bantry's charity tea, a tradition that drew every notable resident, and their secrets, into one room. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a cup of Earl Grey, was in her element, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. The hall buzzed with chatter, much of it centred on Eleanor Vance's murder. The villagers, though careful to maintain decorum, couldn't resist speculating. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles idle in her lap as she listened to the currents of conversation swirling around her. "She was up to no good, that's what I say," Mrs. Price declared from a nearby table, her voice carrying over the clatter of saucers. "Living alone in Rose Cottage, curtains always drawn. What was she hiding?" "Money, probably," Miss Weatherby said, her pince-nez glinting with excitement. "Or a lover. Why else would a woman like that come to a place like this?" "Monsieur." Marple's lips twitched. A lover was a popular theory, but it didn't fit the scratches on Eleanor's hands or the broken locket. Still, she let the gossip flow, noting the undercurrents of envy and fear. Eleanor Vance had been an outsider, and in St. Mary's Mead that alone was enough to spark suspicion. Across the room, Mrs. Bantry was holding court, her laughter a touch too bright. She caught Miss Marple's eye and made her way over, settling into the chair beside her with a rustle of silk. "Jane, you're awfully quiet," she said, lowering her voice. "What do you make of all this talk? They're saying Eleanor Vance was a thief, or worse." "People will say anything when they're frightened," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "But fear often hides truth. Tell me, Dolly, have you heard anything about the Havishams lately?" Mrs. Bantry blinked, caught off guard. "The Havishams? Goodness, that's a name I haven't heard in years. They owned the manor before Arthur and I bought it. Died out mostly. Some scandal about the son, I think. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just a passing thought," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to the vicar, who stood awkwardly by the refreshment table. Mr. Clement was sipping tea, but his gaze was distant, his fingers fidgeting with his collar. I heard Eleanor Vance was seen near their graves in the churchyard." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Really? How peculiar. The Havishams were a queer lot, you know. The son, Edward was it, ran off decades ago after some trouble. Debt, or a woman, or both. The manor was sold to pay their bills. Do you think it's connected?" "Everything is connected in a village like this," Miss Marple said softly. "The trick is finding the thread." Their conversation was interrupted by a stir at the door. A young woman entered, her auburn hair tucked under a stylish hat, her coat too elegant for St. Mary's Mead. Whispers rippled through the room. She was a stranger, and strangers were rare these days. She scanned the crowd, then approached Mrs. Clement, who greeted her with a nervous smile. "Who's that?" Mrs. Bantry murmured, craning her neck. "I don't know," Miss Marple said, but her attention sharpened. The woman's posture was tense, her movements deliberate, as if she were searching for something, or someone. When she leaned in to speak to Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife glanced toward her husband, her face paling. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her mind racing. The stranger's arrival so soon after the murder was no coincidence. She made a mental note to inquire discreetly, perhaps through Clara at the shop, who had a knack for overhearing things. The tea party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Miss Weatherby, emboldened by the stranger's presence, launched into a new theory. "I bet Eleanor Vance was blackmailing someone," she said, her voice loud enough to draw glances. "That's why she was killed. She knew something big." "Blackmail," Mrs. Price scoffed, though her eyes gleamed with interest. "Who'd she blackmail in this village? We've no secrets worth killing for." "Oh, I wouldn't be so sure," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. Her gaze flickered to the vicar, who had spilled tea on his sleeve and was dabbing at it with a napkin, his hands trembling. Then to the stranger, who was now speaking quietly with Mrs. Bantry, her expression guarded. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple gathered more fragments of gossip. A rumour that Eleanor had been seen carrying a locked diary, a claim that she'd asked the postmaster about old village records, and a whisper that she'd visited the churchyard more than once. Each piece was a thread in the tapestry of the murder, and Miss Marple was beginning to see a pattern, one tied to the Havishams, the vicarage, and a scandal that refused to stay buried. The tea party ended with a raffle, but Miss Marple slipped out early, her mind abuzz. The stranger's arrival had stirred the village like a stone dropped in a pond, and the ripples were spreading. Eleanor Vance had come to St. Mary's Mead with a purpose, and someone had killed to keep it hidden. As Miss Marple walked home, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot, she felt the weight of the mystery settling around her. The truth was close. She could sense it, but it would take patience to unravel it. Chapter 5. The Locked Diary. The morning after the tea party, St. Mary's Mead was shrouded in mist, the kind that clung to the hedgerows and muffled the world in secrecy. Miss Marple, undeterred by the damp, made her way to Rose Cottage, the late Eleanor Vance's rented home. She carried a parcel of old parish newsletters, a flimsy excuse for her visit, but sufficient to gain entry. Inspector Craddock had allowed limited access to the cottage under supervision, and Miss Marple, with her knack for being unobtrusive, had secured an invitation to assist with sorting Eleanor's belongings for the police. The cottage was small and weathered, its ivy-clad walls giving it a forlorn air. Inside, it was sparsely furnished, a sagging armchair, a rickety table, and a single bookshelf with a handful of worn novels. Constable Harris, a young man with a nervous tic, stood guard by the door, watching as Miss Marple moved with deliberate care. "Not much to see, is there?" Harris remarked, shifting his weight. "She didn't have much, this Miss Vance. Makes you wonder why she bothered coming here." "Doesn't it, though?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild as she peered at a stack of letters on the table. They were mundane. Bills, a subscription notice for a gardening magazine. But her eyes lingered on a small, leather-bound book tucked beneath them. It was no larger than a prayer book, its cover scuffed and its clasp locked with a tiny brass padlock. "A diary. Constable," she said, holding it up. "I assume this has been examined?" Harris nodded. "Aye, but it's locked tight, and we haven't found the key. Inspector says it's probably just personal scribbles. We'll get it open eventually." "Eventually," Miss Marple echoed, her fingers tracing the clasp. "Might I take a closer look? It could be useful, you know." Harris hesitated, then shrugged. "Suppose it can't hurt. Just don't break it, mind." She settled into the armchair, the diary in her lap, and studied it under the pretence of idle curiosity. The lock was sturdy but not complex. A hairpin might do the trick, though she'd need privacy for that. For now, she noted the faint scratches around the clasp, as if someone had tried and failed to force it open. Interesting. As Harris busied himself with a crate of kitchenware, Miss Marple slipped into the bedroom, a cramped space with a single bed and a wardrobe. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and on the nightstand sat a chipped teacup and a dog-eared copy of Wuthering Heights. She opened the wardrobe, revealing a few dresses, plain but well made, and a shoebox tucked in the corner. Inside were odds and ends, a brooch, a faded ribbon, and to her delight, a tiny brass key. "Constable Harris," she called softly, "I've found something. Perhaps the key to that diary?" Harris hurried over, his eyes widening. "Blimey, you've got a nose for this, Miss Marple. Let's see if it fits." It did. The lock clicked open, revealing pages filled with Eleanor Vance's neat, slanting handwriting. Harris leaned over, but Miss Marple angled the diary slightly, her voice calm. "Perhaps I could read it first. A woman's diary can be delicate." Harris blushed, stepping back. "Right, of course. Just let me know if there's anything important." She began to read, her heart quickening. The entries were dated, starting a month before Eleanor's arrival in St. Mary's, Mead. They were cryptic, written in a shorthand that suggested caution. Septet 3. Arrived at RC village smaller than I expected. Must be discreet. The truth is here. I know it. Septet 10. Churchyard at dusk. H. Grave confirmed. The dates match. Why no record? Sept 15. Spoke to P. He knows more than he says. Nervous. I pushed too hard. Sept 20. Someone followed me tonight. Footsteps in the lane. Must hide this. The final entry, dated 2 days before her death, was a single line. Found it. The proof is in the stone. Tomorrow I confront him. Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind racing. H. Grave could only mean the Havisham plot in the churchyard, as the vicar had mentioned. P. was likely a person, perhaps the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose initials were L.C., but in a village this small, nicknames or aliases were common. The proof in the stone was tantalizingly vague. A gravestone, perhaps, or something hidden within it. Anything useful? Harris asked. Peering over, possibly, Miss Marple said, handing him the diary with a smile. You'll want to show this to Inspector Craddock. It suggests Miss Vance was searching for something that got her killed. As Harris took the diary, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the mist was beginning to lift. The mention of the Havisham grave aligned with the vicar's story. But the diary hinted at a deeper purpose. Eleanor had found proof. Proof of what? A scandal, a crime, or something more personal? And who had followed her that night? Before leaving, Miss Marple paused by the bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spine of Wuthering Heights. On impulse, she opened it, revealing a folded piece of paper tucked inside. A map of the churchyard, hand-drawn, with the Havisham plot circled in red ink. She slipped it into her pocket, her expression serene. The police would have their evidence, but she would follow her own path. As she stepped out into the misty lane, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery deepen. Eleanor Vance had been no ordinary visitor. She had come to St. Mary's Mead to unearth a secret, and that secret had led to her death. The diary, with its cryptic clues, was a key. But to what lock? Miss Marple resolved to visit the churchyard herself, to see what proof lay hidden in the stone. Chapter 6. The Stranger's Visit. The sun broke through the mist by Monday morning, casting a golden glow over St. Mary's Mead. But the village's mood remained shadowed. Eleanor Vance's murder had cracked the veneer of tranquillity, and the discovery of her cryptic diary had only fueled speculation. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the village's pulse, sensed a new disturbance as she walked to the post office, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. The air carried whispers of a stranger, a woman who had appeared at the tea party and was now asking questions about Eleanor. The post office was crowded, as it often was when gossip was ripe. Miss Marple slipped inside, nodding to Clara, the young assistant, who was sorting letters with an ear tuned to the chatter. At the counter, Mrs. Price was regaling a small audience with the latest tidbit. "She's staying at the Blue Boar, bold as brass," Mrs. Price said, her eyes gleaming. "Says her name's Margaret Shaw, but I don't trust it. Too polished, that one. City manners, city clothes. What's she doing here, I ask you?" "Looking for trouble, I'd wager," Miss Weatherby chimed in, adjusting her pince-nez. "Clara. Says she was asking about Rose Cottage yesterday. Wanted to know who Eleanor Vance spoke to, where she went. Sounds like she's sniffing after something." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Margaret Shaw, the auburn-haired woman from the tea party. Her tense exchange with Mrs. Clement had lingered in Miss Marple's mind, and now she was probing into Eleanor's life. A friend, a foe, or something else entirely. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, approaching the counter, "did this Miss Shaw mention why she's interested in Miss Vance?" Clara glanced up, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, exactly, Miss Marple. She was polite but sharp, you know. Asked if Eleanor had any visitors, or if she'd been to the churchyard often. I told her I didn't know much, but she kept pressing. Said she was a distant relation looking to settle Eleanor's affairs." "A distant relation," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes twinkling. "How curious. And did she say anything else?" Clara hesitated, then leaned closer. "She asked about the Havishams. Wanted to know if their old manor was still standing. I thought it odd, seeing as the Bantrys live there now." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. The Havishams, again. First the grave, then Eleanor's diary, and now this stranger. The threads were converging, but the pattern remained elusive. Her thoughts were interrupted by the jingle of the post-office door. The woman herself, Margaret Shaw, stepped, inside, her auburn hair catching the light, her coat tailored to perfection. The room fell quiet, every eye on her. She approached the counter with a cool smile, ignoring the stares. "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth but edged with authority. "I'd like to collect any mail addressed to Eleanor Vance. I'm handling her estate." Mrs. Price bristled. "Handling her estate? And who are you to do that, may I ask?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "A family friend, as I told the innkeeper. I have papers if you need them." "Papers or no," Mrs. Price snapped, "the police have her things now. You'll have to talk to Inspector Craddock." Margaret's eyes flickered, but she nodded. "Of course, thank you." Her gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Miss Marple, who returned it with a serene nod. Then she turned and left, the door jingling behind her. The post office erupted in whispers, but Miss Marple was already moving. She thanked Clara and stepped outside, her mind racing. Margaret Shaw's claim of being a family friend didn't align with her earlier story of being a distant relation, and her interest in the Havishams suggested a deeper connection to Eleanor's purpose in St. Mary's Mead. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Blue Boar Inn, where Margaret was staying. The innkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, was a talkative sort, easily persuaded by a compliment on his ale. Over a cup of tea, he confided that Miss Shaw had arrived 2 days after the murder, paying in advance for a week's stay. She'd asked about the village's history, particularly the Havisham family, and had been seen walking toward the churchyard at dusk. "She's a queer one," Mr. Dobbs said, polishing a glass. "Keeps to herself, but I heard her on the telephone last night, talking low, sounded agitated, kept saying, 'It's here, I know it's here.' Did she now?" Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "And did she mention what it might be?" Mr. Dobbs shook his head. "Not a word, but she had a map with her. Old crumpled thing. Looked like she was marking something on it." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her thoughts turning to the hand-drawn map she'd found in Eleanor's copy of Wuthering Heights, the churchyard, the Havisham grave, and now Margaret Shaw's map. Something was hidden there, something worth killing for. But what? And how did Margaret fit into it? As she passed the churchyard on her way home, Miss Marple paused at the gate. The Havisham plot was visible in the fading light, its moss-covered stones silent witnesses to the past. Margaret Shaw's arrival had stirred the village's unease, and her questions echoed Eleanor's own. Was she an ally seeking justice, or a predator circling the same secret? Miss Marple tightened her shawl against the evening chill. The stranger's visit had raised more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The truth lay buried in the Havisham scandal, and Margaret Shaw was dangerously close to unearthing it. Miss Marple resolved to keep a close eye on her, and to revisit the churchyard herself before someone else got there first. Chapter 7. Shadows of the Past. The library of St. Mary's Mead was little more than a single room in the village hall, its shelves sagging under the weight of dusty tomes and yellowed parish records. It was here, on a rainy Tuesday morning, that Miss Marple settled with a cup of tea and a stack of old newspapers, determined to unravel the Havisham scandal that seemed to thread through Eleanor Vance's murder. The air smelled of mildew and ink, and the only sound was the soft patter of rain against the windows, a perfect setting for unearthing buried truths. Miss Marple had always believed that the past held the key to the present, especially in a village like St. Mary's Mead, where memories lingered like ghosts. The Havisham family, once lords of the manor, had left a legacy of whispers, wealth squandered, a son disgraced, and a tragedy that no one spoke of directly. Eleanor's interest in their grave, coupled with Margaret Shaw's probing, suggested that the scandal was more than idle gossip. It was the motive for murder. She began with the parish records, her fingers tracing faded entries from the 1890s. The Havishams had been prominent, their name etched in baptisms, marriages, and burials. Edward Havisham, the wayward son, was mentioned in an 1895 marriage to a woman named Clara Dunlay, but the record ended abruptly. No children, no further entries. Curious. Next, she turned to the newspapers, starting with the Much Benham Gazette from 1896. A headline caught her eye: Havisham heir disappears amid debt scandal. The article detailed Edward's flight from St. Mary's Mead after accruing massive gambling debts, leaving his young wife Clara to face creditors. The manor was sold, and Clara vanished soon after, rumoured to have died in poverty. But a smaller article, buried on page 5, hinted at more. Local woman claims Havisham hid fortune before fleeing. The woman, unnamed, alleged that Edward had concealed assets, jewels or documents, in the village, but no proof was found. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A hidden fortune could explain Eleanor's obsession with the Havisham grave and the proof in the stone from her diary. Had she been searching for Edward's lost wealth? And was Margaret Shaw after the same prize? Her thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Bantry, who bustled in, shaking rain from her umbrella. "Jane, I knew I'd find you here, nose deep in some mystery," she said, plopping into a chair. "What's all this about the Havishams? You've got that look in your eye." Miss Marple smiled, closing the newspaper. "Just indulging an old woman's curiosity, Dolly. The Havishams seem to keep cropping up, don't they? First Eleanor, now this Miss Shaw. I wonder if they were chasing the same ghost." "Ghost?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You mean that old story about Edward's treasure? Arthur used to laugh about it. Said the manor's attics were searched top to bottom when we bought it. Nothing but cobwebs and a cracked chamber pot." "Perhaps they looked in the wrong place," Miss Marple said softly. "Eleanor was drawn to the churchyard, not the manor, and her diary mentioned a stone." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "A stone? You don't think— Oh, Jane, you're not suggesting there's actually something hidden out there?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, her tone measured, "that Eleanor believed there was, and someone killed her to keep it hidden there." Conversation paused as Clara, the post office assistant, entered, carrying a bundle of books to return. She hesitated, catching Miss Marple's eye. "Miss Marple, I overheard something at the post office this morning about that Miss Shaw." "Do tell, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice encouraging. Clara glanced around, then whispered, "She was on the telephone, talking to someone in London. I didn't mean to listen, but she was loud. Said she'd found the proof and needed to meet someone tomorrow night, at the churchyard. She mentioned the Havisham grave, specific-like." Miss Marple's needles, which had been idle, began to click softly. "Did she say anything else, dear? A name, perhaps?" Clara shook her head. "No, but she sounded scared. Kept saying, 'If I don't get it now, it's all for nothing.'" Then she hung up and left in a hurry. "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. Margaret Shaw was moving quickly. Too quickly. If she was meeting someone at the churchyard, it could be the killer, or another victim in the making. Mrs. Bantry, catching the shift in Miss Marple's expression, leaned closer. "Jane, what are you thinking? You've got that gleam again." "I'm thinking," Miss Marple said, folding her newspaper, "that the Havisham scandal is very much alive. Edward may have left debts, but he also left something behind. Something worth killing for. And Miss Shaw is walking a dangerous path." As they left the library, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of secrets. Miss Marple glanced toward the church spire, visible through the mist. The Havisham grave held the key. She was certain of it. But the proof in the stone was no longer just a clue. It was a lure, drawing Margaret Shaw into the same trap that had claimed Eleanor Vance. Miss Marple resolved to visit the churchyard that evening, before Margaret's mysterious meeting. The shadows of the past were lengthening, and if she didn't act soon, the village might see another body in its quiet earth. Chapter 8. The Midnight Intruder. The moon hung low over St. Mary's Mead, its pale light filtering through the bare branches of the elms. Rose Cottage stood silent at the edge of the village, its windows dark, its secrets locked within. Miss Marple, bundled in a dark coat and scarf, approached the cottage under the cover of night. She had no intention of breaking in. Such things were hardly her style, but she needed to examine the churchyard map she'd found in Eleanor's book, and the cottage, still under police watch during the day, was her only chance to do so undisturbed. Her visit to the churchyard earlier that evening had yielded little. The Havisham grave was undisturbed, its moss-covered stone revealing no obvious proof, but the map, with its red-inked circle, suggested something hidden, perhaps beneath or within the stone itself. Miss Marple had tucked the map into her knitting bag, intending to study it at home, but a nagging instinct had drawn her here instead. Eleanor's diary had mentioned footsteps in the lane, and Margaret Shaw's planned meeting at the churchyard tomorrow night hinted at danger. Time was running out. The cottage gate creaked as she slipped through, her steps light on the gravel path. The front door was locked, but a small window in the kitchen, left ajar for ventilation, offered entry. With surprising agility for a woman of her years, Miss Marple eased it open and climbed inside, her heart steady despite the thrill of trespass. The kitchen was, as she remembered, sparse with a faint smell of lavender. She moved to the sitting room, where the bookshelf stood, and retrieved Wuthering Heights from its place. The map was still there, its edges worn. She unfolded it under the faint moonlight, tracing the circled Havisham plot. A tiny annotation, barely legible, caught her eye, beneath the angel's shadow. An angel! The churchyard had no angel statues, but perhaps a carving on the stone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud from the back door. She froze, her breath catching. The sound came again, a deliberate scrape, like a key probing a lock. Someone was trying to get in. Miss Marple slipped the map into her pocket and moved silently to the shadows of the sitting room, her knitting bag clutched close. The back door creaked open, and footsteps, slow, cautious, entered the kitchen. A figure emerged, cloaked in darkness, their silhouette tall and lean. They carried a small torch, its beams sweeping the room, lingering on the bookshelf. She held her breath, her mind racing. The intruder was searching for something, likely the map or the diary. But who? Margaret Shaw, following her own trail. The vicar, hiding a deeper secret. Or someone else entirely. The figure moved to the table, rifling through the stack of letters Miss Marple had seen days before. A muttered curse broke the silence, male, low, and frustrated. Not Margaret, then. The torch beam swung toward the bookshelf, and Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding now. If she were caught, explanations would be difficult. The intruder paused, as if sensing her presence. The beam darted toward her corner, and she acted on instinct, nudging a teacup on the nearby table. It clattered to the floor, shattering the silence. The figure spun, the torch beam erratic, and bolted for the back door, their footsteps heavy on the floorboards. Miss Marple waited, counting to 10 before stepping out. The cottage was empty again, the back door swinging in the night air. She hurried to the kitchen, her eyes scanning for clues. On the floor, glinting in the moonlight, was a single cufflink. Silver, engraved with the letter H. Havisham? Or a coincidence? She pocketed the cufflink and slipped out through the window, her pulse still racing. The village was silent as she made her way home, the map and cufflink burning in her pocket. The intruder had been desperate, reckless even, to risk breaking in so soon after the murder. They knew the cottage held answers tied to the Havisham grave and the proof in the stone. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and spread the map on her table. Beneath the angel's shadow. The phrase nagged at her, elusive yet precise. The cufflink, with its H, was another piece of the puzzle, suggesting a connection to the Havisham family, or someone claiming their legacy. And the intruder's male voice ruled out Margaret Shaw, but not the mysterious P from Eleanor's diary, or the man with a limp rumoured to have argued with her. The clock struck 1, its chime a reminder of the hour. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles idle for once. The midnight intruder had confirmed her suspicions. The Havisham scandal was no mere relic of the past. It was alive, dangerous, and worth killing for. Tomorrow night, Margaret Shaw would meet someone at the churchyard, and Miss Marple intended to be there, not as a trespasser, but as a witness to the truth. Chapter 9. The False Alibi. The morning sun did little to dispel the chill that had settled over St. Mary's Mead. The village was on edge, the memory of Eleanor Vance's murder sharpened by whispers of the midnight break-in at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred. The cufflink engraved with an H and the churchyard map's cryptic note, beneath the angel's shadow, had given her a thread to pull, and she intended to follow it straight to the heart of the Havisham scandal. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she found Inspector Craddock in the parlour, his notebook open and his expression weary. He was questioning Mr. Clement, whose nervous fidgeting had grown more pronounced since their last encounter. Mrs. Clement hovered nearby, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, nodding as she entered. "I might have guessed you'd turn up. Heard about the break-in, I suppose." "Indeed," she replied, settling into a chair with her knitting bag. "A bold move, don't you think? Whoever it was must be quite desperate." Clement's face paled, and he tugged at his collar. "Desperate? I don't know what you mean. It's dreadful, of course, but surely it's just vandals." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Vandals don't leave silver cufflinks behind, Mr. Clement, nor do they search for specific items, like a map or a diary. Craddock's head snapped up. "Cufflink? You found something at the cottage?" She produced the cufflink from her bag, its H glinting in the light. "Dropped by the intruder, I believe. It's rather fine, wouldn't you say? Not the sort of thing a common thief would wear." Clement stared at it, his hands trembling. I've never seen it before," he stammered. "Why would you think it's connected to me?" "Oh, I don't," Miss Marple said mildly. "But you did know Eleanor Vance, didn't you? More than you let on. Her diary mentioned a P, someone she pressed for answers. And you, Mr. Clement, were seen speaking with her in the churchyard." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Is this true, Vicar? You told me you only met her once, at a service." Clement's shoulders slumped, his voice barely a whisper. I may have spoken to her briefly, yes. She came to me one evening, asking about the Havisham family. She was insistent, almost frantic, wanted to know about Edward Havisham's wife, Clara. I told her I knew nothing, but she wouldn't let it go. "And why didn't you mention this?" Craddock pressed, his tone sharp. "I was afraid," Clement admitted, his eyes darting to his wife. "She seemed dangerous somehow, as if she was stirring up trouble. And then she was killed, and I thought, well, I didn't want to be involved." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Trouble, Mr. Clement? What sort of trouble?" Hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "The Havishams. There's a story, an old one, about Clara Dunley, Edward's wife. After he fled, she was left penniless, but some said she hid something valuable before she disappeared. A jewel, or papers, or I don't know. Eleanor kept asking about it, as if she believed it was true. And where were you the night she was killed?" Craddock asked, his pen poised. Clement swallowed. "Here, at the vicarage, preparing my sermon. Griselda can confirm it." Mrs. Clement nodded quickly. "He was here all evening, never left the house." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "How curious! You see, I happened to speak with young Tommy Pierce, who delivers the Evening Post. He mentioned seeing you near Rose Cottage that night, Mr. Clement, around 9 o'clock. He was quite certain." Clement's face drained of colour. "Tommy? He's mistaken. I was here, I swear it." "Boys can be mistaken, Miss Marple," said gently, "but Tommy's a sharp lad, and Rose Cottage is a fair walk from the vicarage. Perhaps you stepped out for air." Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. "Vicar, if you're hiding something, now's the time to say it. Your alibi's crumbling, and that cufflink doesn't help your case." Clement's hands shook, and he buried his face in them. "I didn't kill her," he whispered. "But I did go to Rose Cottage that night. She sent me a note, begging me to meet her. Said she'd found proof, something about the Havisham grave. I went to tell her to stop, to leave the past, alone. It was dangerous, stirring up old wounds." "And what happened?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice soft but insistent. "She was alive when I left," he said desperately, "upset, but alive. She showed me a letter, old, brittle, signed by Clara Dunley. It mentioned a hiding place in the churchyard, under a stone. I told her to give it to the police, but she refused. Said she had to confront someone first. Craddock's pen scratched furiously. Who? Did she name them? Clement shook his head. No, I left, and that was the last I saw of her. I swear, I didn't touch her. Miss Marple sat back, her needle still. The vicar's story rang true, but it revealed a motive. He feared the scandal's exposure, perhaps because it touched him personally. The letter from Clara Dunley was new, a tangible link to the proof in the stone, and the cufflink, with its H, suggested someone else was involved, someone tied to the Havisham legacy. As Craddock pressed Clement for more details, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Margaret Shaw's planned meeting at the churchyard that night. The vicar's broken alibi had narrowed the field, but the killer was still out there, watching, waiting. The letter, the map, the cufflink, all pointed to the Havisham grave, and Miss Marple knew she had to act before the truth was buried again. She rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Thank you, Mr. Clement. You've been most helpful." Craddock shot her a look, half exasperated, half admiring. "Miss Marple, if you've got any more tricks up your sleeve, I'd appreciate a heads up." "Oh, I'm just an old woman, with too much time on her hands," she said, smiling. But as she left the vicarage, her mind was anything but idle. The false alibi had cracked open the case, and the churchyard meeting loomed like a storm on the horizon. Tonight she would be there, hidden in the shadows, ready to catch a killer. Chapter 10. The buried truth. The churchyard of St. Mary's Mead was a place of quiet reverence by day, but at dusk it took on an eerie stillness, the gravestones casting long shadows like fingers reaching from the past. Miss Marple stood by the Havisham plot, her scarf pulled tight against the evening chill, her eyes fixed on the moss-covered stone that had haunted her thoughts. The map's note, beneath the angel's shadow, and the vicar's mention of Clara Dunley's letter had led her here hours before Margaret Shaw's mysterious meeting. She was determined to find the proof in the stone before the killer could claim it. The Havisham grave was unremarkable at first glance. A weathered slab inscribed with the names of Edward Havisham's parents, dated 1880. No angel statue stood nearby, but Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the stone's edge. A faint carving caught her eye, a small stylized angel etched into the base, almost hidden by moss. Her heart quickened beneath the angel's shadow. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then pressed gently on the carving. Nothing. She traced its outline, feeling for irregularities. A soft click rewarded her efforts, and a small section of the stone shifted, revealing a hollow compartment no larger than a cigar box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers, brittle with age. Miss Marple slipped the bundle into her knitting bag and replaced the stone, her movements swift but calm. The churchyard was silent, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes. She hurried home, locking her cottage door before spreading the papers on her table under the glow of a lamp. The bundle contained 3 items: a letter, a legal document, and a single photograph. The letter, in Clara Dunlee's elegant script, was addressed to no one. A confession of sorts. "If you find this, know that I hid the truth to protect her. Edward was a fool, but not a thief. The deed is real, and the child is his. I buried it here where none would look, for her sake. Forgive me. The legal document was a deed of trust, dated 1895, granting a substantial sum to the issue of Edward, Havisham, and Clara Dunley. It was signed by Edward and witnessed by a village solicitor, long dead. The photograph showed a young girl, perhaps 10, with solemn eyes, the same face as in Eleanor Vance's locket. Miss Marple sat back, her mind piecing the puzzle together. Clara Dunley had borne Edward's child, a daughter hidden from the world to shield her from scandal. The deed secured her inheritance, but Clara, abandoned and disgraced, had concealed it in the churchyard, fearing it would be stolen by creditors or worse. Eleanor Vance, somehow connected to this child, had come to St. Mary's Mead to claim the truth, perhaps as the heir herself, or her descendant, but someone had killed to keep the deed buried. The cufflink with its H flashed in her memory, along with the vicar's broken alibi and Margaret Shaw's probing. The letter's mention of a child suggested a motive, an inheritance worth killing for. But who stood to lose if the deed surfaced? The Havisham line was thought extinct, yet the cufflink hinted at a claimant, or an impostor. A knock at the door startled her. She tucked the papers into her bag and opened it to find Inspector Craddock, his face grim. "Miss Marple, I need your help," he said without preamble. "Margaret Shaw's gone missing. She was seen heading to the churchyard an hour ago, but no one's found her." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "The churchyard? Tonight?" Craddock nodded. "Clara at the post office overheard her on the phone, arranging a meeting. We're searching now. But if you know anything at all—" "I know this," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. She handed him the cufflink and recounted her discovery in the churchyard, omitting only the exact contents of the papers, for now. "The killer is tied to the Havisham legacy, Inspector, and I fear Miss Shaw may be in grave danger." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Stay here, Miss Marple. It's not safe." "Oh, I'm quite safe," she said, her eyes twinkling. "But I'll come with you if I may. I believe I know where to look." Reluctantly, Craddock agreed, and they set off for the churchyard, the night closing around them. Miss Marple clutched her bag, the hidden papers a heavy weight. The buried truth was out, and it pointed to the killer, a shadow from the Havisham past, desperate to keep the inheritance lost. As they neared the churchyard, a faint cry echoed through the darkness, and Miss Marple knew the trap was closing, not just for Margaret Shaw, but for the murderer as well. Chapter 11. The Trap is Set. The vicarage parlour was aglow with lamplight, its chintz curtains drawn against the October night. Miss Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her calm demeanour belying the storm she was about to unleash. The room was crowded with the key players in St. Mary's Mead's unfolding drama, summoned under the guise of a village meeting to discuss the recent disturbances. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his expression stern, while Miss Marple's quiet authority orchestrated the scene. Margaret Shaw, found shaken but unharmed in the churchyard the previous night, sat pale and silent, her auburn hair tucked under a scarf. She'd been lured there by an anonymous note, she claimed, and had narrowly escaped an unseen assailant. Mr. Clement, his hands fidgeting, avoided her gaze, while Mrs. Clement hovered nervously, offering tea no one wanted. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for drama, perched on a sofa, her eyes darting between faces. And at the edge of the room stood Mr. Dobbs, the innkeeper, who had reluctantly agreed to attend after Miss Marple's pointed request. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Eleanor Vance's murder and the Havisham scandal pressing on every mind. Miss Marple had shared just enough with Craddock to ensure his cooperation. The hidden deed, Clara Dunley's letter, and the photograph linking Eleanor to the Havisham heir. But the killer's identity remained elusive, and tonight she intended to flush them out. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but clear. "I know these are troubling times with poor Miss Vance's death and the recent incidents, but I believe we're close to the truth, and your presence here will help us find it." Craddock cleared his throat. "Let's be clear. Someone in this village knows more than they're saying. Eleanor Vance was killed to protect a secret, and Miss Shaw was nearly next. If anyone has information, speak now." Margaret Shaw's eyes flashed. "I've told you everything," she said, her voice sharp. "I came to find Eleanor's papers. She was my cousin, tracing our family's claim to the Havisham estate. She found proof, but someone got to her first." "Proof?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "You mean that old story about Edward Havisham's treasure?" "Not treasure," Miss Marple said softly, her needles pausing. "A deed of trust hidden by Clara Dunley for her child, Edward's child. Eleanor Vance believed she was the descendant of that child, entitled to an inheritance. Someone killed her to keep it buried." Mr. Clement's hands shook, and he tugged at his collar. I told you, I tried to warn her off. She was stirring up trouble, digging into things best left alone." "Things like the Havisham grave?" Miss Marple's eyes fixed on him, mild but piercing. "You met her the night she died, Mr. Clement. You saw her letter from Clara. Did you tell anyone else?" "No," he protested, his voice rising. "I swear I left her alive." Miss Marple turned to Margaret. "And you, Miss Shaw, you came to St. Mary's Mead after Eleanor's death, searching for the same deed. But you knew more than you've admitted, didn't you? Your cousin shared her findings, perhaps even the location of the proof." Margaret's jaw tightened. "She wrote to me, yes. Said she'd found a hiding place in the churchyard. I came to finish what she started, and nearly paid with your life," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic but probing. Someone lured you to the churchyard last night, just as they followed Eleanor. Someone who knew what you were both after." Mrs. Clement's teapot clattered, and all eyes turned to her. "This is nonsense," she cried. "Why are we being accused? We're respectable people." "No one's accusing anyone," Miss Marple said calmly. "But secrets have a way of surfacing, like this." She reached into her knitting bag and produced the silver cufflink, its H gleaming in the lamplight. Found at Rose Cottage after the break-in, it suggests a connection to the Havisham name, or someone claiming it. Mr. Dobbs, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably. "What's that got to do with me?" he muttered. "I run an inn, not a conspiracy." Miss Marple's gaze settled on him. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Dobbs, telling me about Miss Shaw's telephone calls, but you also mentioned a map she carried. Did you see it, or perhaps recognize it?" Dobbs flushed, his hands clenching. "I don't know what you're implying. I mind my own business." "Of course, Miss Marple," said her smile disarming. But Eleanor's map, marked with the Havisham grave, was specific, and the intruder at Rose Cottage was looking for it or something like it. Someone who knew its value. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Craddock's eyes narrowed, sensing the trap closing. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice steady. "The killer is here among us. They killed Eleanor to protect the Havisham secret, and they tried to silence Miss Shaw for the same reason. But the truth is out now. The deed, the letter, the child. And I believe one of you knows exactly who that child was." A log cracked in the fireplace, and Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Jane, you don't mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple said, her eyes sweeping the room, "that the killer's motive is tied to the Havisham heir, and they've made one mistake too many." She paused, letting the silence stretch, watching each face for a telltale sign. Fear, guilt, or defiance. The cufflink, the deed, and Clara's letter were her bait, and the killer, she knew, would not resist the lure. Tonight the trap was set, and the truth would no longer stay buried. Chapter 12. The Final Twist. The vicarage parlour seemed to hold its breath, the lamplight flickering across the faces of the gathered suspects. Miss Marple's words hung in the air like a blade, poised to cut through the web of lies surrounding Eleanor Vance's murder. The silver cufflink, the hidden deed, and Clara Dunley's letter had drawn the killer into her trap, and now, with every eye on her, she prepared to reveal the truth. Inspector Craddock stood ready, his hand resting lightly on his notebook, sensing the moment's weight. Margaret Shaw's gaze was steely. Mr. Clement's hands trembled, and Mrs. Bantry clutched her teacup as if it were a lifeline. Mr. Dobbs, the innkeeper, shifted in his chair, his face a mask of unease. Mrs. Clement, pale and silent, stared at the floor. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice calm but commanding. "The Havisham scandal has cast a long shadow over St. Mary's Mead, she began. Clara Dunley hid a deed to protect her child, Edward Havisham's child, an heir to a fortune no one knew existed. Eleanor Vance came here to claim that inheritance, and she died for it. But the killer wasn't just protecting money. They were protecting a secret far more personal. She turned to Margaret Shaw. You claimed to be Eleanor's cousin, Miss Shaw, tracing the Havisham line. But your story has holes. Eleanor's diary never mentioned a cousin, only a P she pressed for answers. And your map, so conveniently similar to hers, suggests you knew exactly what she was after. Margaret's eyes narrowed. I told you, I came to finish her work. I'm no killer. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. But you've been less than truthful. The telephone call Clara overheard. You spoke of proof and a meeting, but you never mentioned Eleanor's letter from Clara Dunley. Why? Margaret hesitated, her composure slipping. I didn't think it mattered. I was focused on the deed. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mr. Clement. And you, Vicar, lied about your meeting with Eleanor. You saw her letter, knew it pointed to the churchyard. Your fear of scandal was real, but was it fear for the village, or for yourself? Clement's voice cracked. I've told you everything. I didn't kill her. I believe you, Miss Marple said, surprising him. Your alibi was false, but your panic was genuine. You're not the killer, but you know more than you've said. Her eyes moved to Mr. Dobbs, whose hands were clenched. Mr. Dobbs, you've been quiet tonight. You saw Miss Shaw's map, overheard her calls. But you also saw Eleanor at the Blue Boar, didn't you? She asked about the Havishams, and you brushed her off. Why? Dobbs scowled. I run an inn. People ask questions. Doesn't mean I'm involved. Doesn't it? Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced the cufflink, its H glinting. This was dropped at Rose Cottage during the break-in. An H for Havisham, perhaps, or for something else. Like Henry. The room froze. Mrs. Clement gasped, her teacup slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. All eyes turned to her husband, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on Dobbs, whose face had gone ashen. Henry Dobbs, she said softly. That's your full name, isn't it? Not many know it. You go by Tom at the inn. But Eleanor did. She wrote P in her diary, not for the vicar, but for publican. You. She pressed you about the Havishams because you're connected to them, aren't you? Dobbs laughed, but it was strained. You're mad, old woman. I'm no Havisham. Oh, but you are, Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through his denial. The photograph in Eleanor's locket. The girl with solemn eyes. It matches one I saw in your inn, tucked behind the bar. Your mother, wasn't it? Clara Dunley's daughter, born in secret, raised under a different name. You're the Havisham heir, Mr. Dobbs, and Eleanor knew it. Craddock stepped forward, his voice sharp. Is this true, Dobbs? Dobbs's eyes darted to the door, but Craddock's constable blocked it. This is nonsense, he growled. You've got no proof. But I do, Miss Marple said, producing Clara's letter from her bag. Clara wrote of her child hidden to protect her. Your mother was that child, and you inherited her claim. But you didn't want it, not if it meant exposing your past. You've built a life here, respectable, quiet. Eleanor's digging threatened to unravel it, to drag your mother's shame into the light. Margaret Shaw gasped. You killed her? My cousin? Dobbs's face twisted, and he lunged to his feet. She wouldn't stop, he shouted. Kept asking about my mother, the Havishams, the deed. Said she'd go public, ruin everything. I followed her, argued with her in the lane. She fought, scratched me. Look! He pulled up his sleeve, revealing faded marks. I didn't mean to kill her. It just happened. And the vicarage garden? Miss Marple pressed, her voice relentless. Why there? To point away from me, Dobbs said, his voice breaking. I thought, the vicar, his lies, it had confused things. I buried her shallow, panicked. And Miss Shaw? Craddock asked, stepping closer. Dobbs's shoulders slumped. I lured her to the churchyard to scare her off. Didn't want another death. The room erupted. Mrs. Bantry's gasp, Margaret's sob, Mrs. Clement's cry. Craddock signalled the constable, who restrained Dobbs as he collapsed into a chair, defeated. Miss Marple sat back, her needles resuming their rhythm, her face serene, but her heart heavy. The twist had been personal, not just a fortune, but a man's fear of his own past. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," Craddock said, shaking his head. "How did you know?" "People are predictable," she said softly. "And secrets, like knitting, always unravel if you tug the right thread." Chapter 13. Resolution at Dawn. The first light of dawn crept over St. Mary's Mead, painting the thatched roofs and winding lanes in hues of gold and pink. The village, shaken by the revelation of Henry Dobbs's guilt, was slowly reclaiming its rhythm, though the scars of the Havisham scandal would linger. Miss Marple stood at her cottage window, a cup of tea in hand, her knitting folded neatly on the table. The case was closed, but her work was not yet done, not until the village understood the truth and found its peace. By mid-morning, she joined Inspector Craddock and a small gathering at the vicarage, where the air was lighter than the night before. Mrs. Bantry was there, her curiosity undimmed, along with Margaret Shaw, whose grief for her cousin was tempered by gratitude. Mr. and Mrs. Clement sat quietly, their faces etched with relief and lingering guilt. The parlour, once a stage for confrontation, was now a place of reckoning and closure. Craddock, his notebook finally closed, addressed the group. "Henry Dobbs is in custody, charged with Eleanor Vance's murder and the assault on Miss Shaw. He's confessed fully. Says it was panic, not premeditation, but the evidence speaks for itself. Miss Marple, you've got a knack for this. Care to explain how you pieced it together?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It's simply a matter of observation, Inspector. People are like stitches in a pattern. Each one tells a story if you look closely." She set her teacup down and began, her voice steady. "Eleanor Vance came to St. Mary's Mead seeking her heritage. The Havisham inheritance hidden by Clara Dunley for her child. The locket with the girl's photograph was her first clue, a family keepsake. Her diary pointed to the churchyard, where she found Clara's letter and the deed hidden beneath the angel's shadow, a carving on the Havisham grave. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. But how did Dobbs fit in? I never would have guessed he was a Havisham. Nor did he want anyone to, Miss Marple said. His mother was Clara's daughter, raised under a different name to escape the scandal of her birth. Dobbs knew of the deed, but wanted no part of it. His life as the innkeeper was respectable, untainted. Eleanor's questions threatened to expose his past, to drag his mother's shame into the light. He panicked, followed her, and in a moment of rage killed her. Margaret Shaw's voice was soft. "Why the vicarage garden?" "A misdirection," Miss Marple replied. Dobbs knew Mr. Clement had lied about his meeting with Eleanor, so he buried her there to cast suspicion on the vicar. The shallow grave was haste, but also intent. He wanted her found to stir confusion. "And the cufflink?" Craddock asked, holding up the silver H. "A careless mistake," Miss Marple said. Dobbs dropped it during the break-in at Rose Cottage, where he searched for Eleanor's map. The H stood for Henry, not Havisham, but it linked him to the family through his mother. His reaction last night when I named him confirmed it. Mr. Clement cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. I should have been honest from the start. I was afraid the scandal would ruin the village or me. I'm sorry." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Fear makes fools of us all, Mr. Clement, but you didn't kill her, and that's what matters." Mrs. Bantry sighed dramatically. "Jane, you're a marvel. But what about the deed? Does Margaret get the inheritance?" Margaret shook her head. "Eleanor was the true heir through our grandmother, Clara's daughter. I'll see the deed honoured, but it's for her memory, not for me. I don't need the money." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "A wise choice. The Havisham fortune has caused enough pain." As the gathering dispersed, Craddock lingered, offering Miss Marple a wry smile. "You've outdone yourself, Miss Marple. Ever think of joining the force?" "Oh, I'm far too old for that," she laughed, picking up her knitting. "But I do enjoy a puzzle, and St. Mary's Mead never seems to run out of them." By noon, the village was stirring back to life. The post office hummed with gossip, now tempered with relief, and the church bell tolled as if to signal a new chapter. Miss Marple walked home, pausing by the churchyard to glance at the Havisham grave. The stone was silent now, its secrets laid bare. She returned to her cottage, where her chrysanthemums awaited tending. As she knelt in the garden, her trowel breaking the soft earth, she reflected on the case. The Havisham scandal had been a thread of greed and shame woven through generations, but it was love, Clara's for her child, Eleanor's for her heritage, that had brought it to light. Justice was served, and St. Mary's Mead would heal, as it always did. Miss Marple straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. The village was quiet once more, but she knew its peace was fragile, a tapestry of secrets waiting for the next tug. and when it came, she would be ready, her needles at the ready, to unravel the truth once again.